and welcome to another episode of Geetika Ki Canadian Diary. Joining me on the podcast, I have Dr. Joudi from Calgary. Dr. Joudi is an aging and ethnic diversity researcher, consultant, and international speaker on ethnocultural diversity, elder abuse, and ageism. Thank you for your time, Dr. Joudi.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
My very first question, the word aging. How has the definition changed over the course of the last decade or so?
Yeah, that's the word aging, I think, has received a really bad reputation for a while. And I think it's because there has been some form of misunderstanding, or at least the connection has really been a bit confusing for many. When we say the word aging, it really sometimes can be associated with older adults who are growing older, decline. But actually, if you look at it from a biological perspective, aging is anything that's really continuing on that lifespan development and growing. And so we're all aging. You're aging from the time that you were
Hmm.
born. And so aging really is as a form of a development, but we now tend to hear it more often associated with the older adult population. So I would like to kind of maybe clarify that aging initially was looked at decline. I would rather have it seen as growth and potential. Um, there's also now a life expectancy shift. So people didn't have the same life expectancy as a couple of decades ago, or maybe a century ago, as we do right now, especially with life expectancy increasing in many countries, including Canada. So now aging, with that understanding, I guess, with the fact that aging isn't associated only with older adults, aging is a form of a growth, it's development, it's potential, it's gaining, not just losses or declines. The shift now more so is of that of a holistic view of we don't just think about aging. I'm hoping, at least from that physical point of view. I always say this, and I really believe in it, that chronological age is not a sole indicator of people's capabilities and abilities. And I think that is that holistic, more strength-based view of aging or growing older, that we think about mental health and emotional and cognitive health as well, um, about how with growing older we also gain experience and
Experience, very valid.
expertise, that we gain connection and
Mhm.
purpose. And I think that's also kind of reflected in the World Health Organization, where they have a report that came out in 2021 about decades of healthy aging, that really focuses on participation and inclusion of older
Hmm.
people globally.
Interesting. Um, so another question now. Is it recognized or defined the same way across cultures? So how do cultural beliefs shape aging?
Yeah, every now and then you'll have research articles, but also conversations that come out from realizing that the experience of aging is actually, to an extent, universally different. And that's because when you look at countries, cultures, values, traditions, beliefs, spiritual, religious beliefs, they actually all play a role in how we age. And so, and I really don't want to overgeneralize, but for the sake of this conversation, if you look at countries or cultures in which they are referred to as more collectivists, so we are talking about Asian countries, whether they're South Asian or East Asian, or even countries from the Middle East, Arabs, people from the continent of Africa, for example, even our First Nations and Indigenous communities, um, they tend to be more family oriented. Again, not to generalize and say that none of the other cultures
Okay.
are, but if you really focus on what we study in anthropology and even social psychology, we do categorize collectivist and individualistic cultures in different ways. Collectivist cultures tend to look at the group, the family, the tribe as as the unit. And so we do for the group, we do for the family, we do for the community whatever happens to us actually impacts the community as well. So collectivist cultures tend to look at aging differently. It could be that there's more respect or more attention given to older adults. They're referred to in our First Nations and Indigenous communities as in some of them are elders, for example, and so they are given a different role, so to speak. With that being said, there are also individualistic cultures in which within them, each family is also different. And so they also look at their older adults as the head of the household, for example. And so I think the perceptions generally, regardless of being collectivist or individualist cultures by categorization, I think the shift now is more of role-based recognition and perception of shared values and how those shared values of that family or the community actually dictate what aging looks like and what it means.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, Dr. Judy. Actually, in some cultures, I'm from my background is South Asian. We see very close knit families, and as I say that, there are numerous benefits of multi generational homes, but sometimes the boundaries are forgotten. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it can be very hard, I think, right? And I'm from the Middle East. I was born in Iraq. And so when I look at my family, even as we have immigrated to Western communities or cultures and countries where the traditions and the values are different, even when you look at the family unit, some of these families, immigrant families, might still want to uphold some of these values, which might work initially. But then the the interesting thing is about the next generations. What do they see as important and of value to uphold? And then there's subsequent generations. So you do find sometimes that, for example, adult children may not have the same um, or may not value the same values as their aging parents or older parents. It could be disappointing to some of the older parents, for example, when they see their adult children or grandchildren not valuing the same values and traditions, etc. But the reality is that when you're moving and immigrating, things do need to change. They may shift, they may adapt. And it could be a bit difficult for both parties to accept. But I think that's a very important conversation to have within the family, is to be able to communicate, to be able to express safely and freely, and to have these conversations about, why things are changing and how not all change is necessarily bad
Yeah,
change.
yeah, you're right about that. Um, so I'm going to dive into a tough topic here. What is elderly abuse? Can you give examples from various cultures?
Elder abuse or older adult mistreatment, which is now the term that we prefer to actually
Mhm.
use, is has been a hot topic for a very long time, and it has become more of a topic to address and discuss and communicate because of the growing number of older adults globally, and even the World Health Organization is quite invested in older adult mistreatment as well as ageism as well towards older adults. So, in kind of a really quick definition, it's the action or lack of action that prevents, or I mean, I guess in terms of the action, it's the action that causes harm to the older person, or and the lack of action component is when you don't stop the older adult from being harmed. It could include or incorporate forms of physical violence and abuse, pushing, shoving, for example,
Mhm.
slapping, or financial abuse, where you are taking the person is taking advantage of financial assets. It could be psychological and emotional abuse, for example, where there's that kind of psychological and emotional hold that the person who's looking after the older adult could have. It could be threats, it could be verbal abuse, but also it could be neglect and not taking care of them or meeting their basic needs. There's also medication abuse, where you're over medicating or under medicating the older adult. Um, the other aspects of abuse that we now also talk about, especially within immigrant populations, is cultural and spiritual abuse, which could include preventing the older adult from attending their cultural and spiritual or religious events, or maybe enforcing some of those values that might not be ones that the older person wants to abide by. And so it's called the silence. It's a silence factor. And it's because it's an unfortunate experience that some groups, some communities are embarrassed or ashamed or afraid to talk about, or feel that it doesn't happen to them or their community. And that what that does, unfortunately, it prevents disclosure. It prevents communities or people who are experiencing elder abuse from talking about it, because they feel that they could bring shame to the family, shame to the community, embarrassment to their family or community. And that sense of pride and shame is quite high, especially among immigrant families.
Sometimes I feel like it's not intentional. Family members actually may not realize that what they're saying or coming out their mouth, maybe out of concern, but how the other person is taking it and how does it feel to that person, older person in the house. Like certain things, like I noticed that, which I have also learned, that if I am dealing with diabetes, if somebody just makes a comment without knowing about what it is, I'm going to probably feel hurt. And that's not that person's intention, obviously, because they don't know about it. So things like, oh, don't worry, or telling your child, like, don't worry, grandpa or grandma, they won't be able to do it because, they're old. So don't ask them to do that. Like you're just telling your child without thinking how the other person is going to take that. I feel like these kind of things also sometimes you have to be careful when you're wording these things. Um, and I know lots of people say, I just said it because I would be like worried about it crossing the road or being left alone in a mall, or maybe they don't have a cell phone on them. But then I feel like maybe these days we have to be careful because, as you said, we live in a place where they may not have social circle around them to go and interact with. So we may be the only social circle they have, their grandkids, their family at home. Um, what do you have to say? How can we be more careful when we're wording these normal day to day sentences?
That's a really great question, because I do have adult children who ask me this when I do talk to them about the mistreatment of older adults, because I do believe that most families do want to genuinely take care of their older adults. And I think, especially as immigrants or ethnically diverse communities, they're doing the best with whatever best resources they have, with whatever best knowledge they have, with whatever best understanding of what supports they can access. And I think that in itself is what we need to also focus on, is that there is unintentional neglect. So even when we talk about a form of abuse, which is neglect, when we deliberately do not meet the basic needs of older adults, we deliberately don't take them to the doctor, we deliberately don't renew their medication, we deliberately don't bathe them or feed them, that is intentional neglect, that you're doing that knowingly. But there is a form of unintentional neglect. And I always want to emphasize that when I talk to communities, that sometimes we're doing things not knowing that what it is actually causing is harm to the older adult. We do it because we think we know what's
Yeah.
best for them. We do it because we think they can't do things. And so we're trying to speak on their behalf, or do things on their behalf. But also, sometimes when we have communities where maybe the lack of knowledge of what resources are available, maybe it could be a lack of
Mhm.
education. It could be maybe some form of incorrect thought or belief that a person has, and they bring
Yeah.
it here to Canada with them, and they still do the same thing, right? So it could be that back home, for example, we did everything for our older person. Well, in Canada, they're also trying to do everything for their older person, but it could be that the older person now, as they see that they're in a country where there are supports and resources, there are opportunities to socialize, maybe that older adult wants to get out of the house. They want to go beyond the family when it comes to social networks. I think that's really healthy for the older adult, as well as it's actually helpful for the adult child. So the adult child doesn't feel like I don't want to say it's an obligation, because many older adults say we want to do this. So I'm not going to call it an obligation to look after your older person, but it could help sometimes, where it eliminates some of that stress, that you don't have to always do things for your older person. But the older adult, if they're coming to a country where they rely linguistically on their adult children or grandchildren, where they may not be able to drive, and so they rely on family members or people to take them around shopping or to go to their spiritual gatherings, well, then, yeah, there is going to be a bit of that conflict. There's going to be a bit of that challenge. I would suggest, again, to have open communication, to be able to express how you feel, whether it's an adult child or the older adult, and say things in ways that hopefully come across not as, that you're a burden, but more so of what other things can we possibly look for within our community that could help us out. And I think that's also on the onus is also on the community itself. I love to see communities that they themselves have developed their own social gatherings and social networks, where it's that they're empowering their own community within themselves because they can't wait for outside resources to do that for them. So they develop their own social groups. They develop their own intergenerational teams of younger and older people. There was a community here in Calgary where the younger adults drove to the house of the older person because their adult child couldn't take them to this event. So there was an organization that really created an intergenerational, almost an opportunity to have them drive to an older person's house, like carpooling, and bring that older person to the event. And it really created a great connection between the younger person and the older adult. They formed friendships. They talked about historical experiences, etc., that the younger person may have not had experience to, and that helps with that connection, building that relationship between older adults and younger people. I think is immensely important. It breaks down barriers. It helps clarify stereotypes and get rid of these stereotypes and myths, at least. And it's much needed. And I think those things are really important to help eliminate some of the misunderstandings that could occur.
Yeah, and also I wanted to add here that our own beliefs or beliefs of people around us, we may have seen our grandparents slow down at a certain age, they don't want to do certain things, and then we may be assuming, oh, this is how aging will be for my parent as well, and maybe they don't need to go and socialize. I'm going to talk about my own mom. I'm very proud of her. She lives independently. She is busiest, sometimes more busy than I'm like, oh, can you come and help me with this? She has a jam packed calendar and she likes it. So to assume that, oh, she's aging, she's going to want to slow down, not do things is definitely not true. Um, so here's another tricky situation. I know there's data available out there. You've talked about it uh, in other blogs and your own website and LinkedIn talks. But I'm sure the data doesn't cover the true story. There are lots of people who will not report if they're being abused by their children. How can an elderly parent communicate their concerns to family members? Because they're their caretakers.
Yeah, I think that's also one of the conversations that I usually have with some community members is um, we know that elder abuse or older adult mistreatment can happen in any culture and a socioeconomic from any socioeconomic background, from any ethnic, spiritual, religious background. So it's not no ethnic community, no community is immune to the mistreatment of older people. And so I clarify that we have to be able to accept that it could happen. Now, how can we prevent it from happening to your families or your communities? How can we understand what the signs are? What is it about this that some communities don't feel comfortable about? And so I kind of try to break down gently and as culturally appropriate as possible um, the reasons why there are some form of reluctance. And usually, like I said before, it's because of that shame, that embarrassment, that fear of what this is going to do to the reputation of the community or
Mhm.
the family. Like I said, some collectivist cultures are more concerned about the reputation that could be tainted, for example. And this is in some cultures. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but there is the underreporting, especially when there's that sense of needing to protect the family from outside
Judgment or shame. Yeah,
noise.
yeah.
Absolutely, right. And so I think one of the things that I usually would suggest and recommend is to really just have an understanding that this isn't right to be experienced by any person, regardless of how old they are. But in particular for people who feel dependent on others to look after them. And so one of the risk factors, I guess, of underreporting is when the older adult is dependent on the person who's looking after them. Because if I speak up about them abusing me or mistreating me, then who's going to look after me? Because they're looking after me. Who's going to take me to my
Mhm.
appointments? Who's going to, where am I going to live if they're housing them, right? So those are some of the risk factors where the concern is if I speak, then what's going to happen to me or what's going to happen to my grandchildren, etc., right? And so I try to clarify that this is wrong, but there are resources and supports, and we have to be comfortable with having those opportunities to communicate and to talk about what are the risk factors. And there are programs where we ask neighbors to keep an eye out on your neighbor. If you find that a friend of yours or a neighbor used to attend a spiritual or religious event or a social event and they're not, check in on them. But we also try to again eliminate some of these barriers. Why do we not value old what possibly could be the reason why some older adults are not valued? um, let's discuss the stereotypes, let's discuss the myths, build intergenerational relationships with younger and older people, involve, in some cases people want people from within their community to be involved and not external people from
Mhm.
outside, because maybe there's a history of mistrust with external resources historically. And so they only want someone from within their community. It could be their religious or spiritual leader. It could be someone that they trust within the community that is an elder, for example, who that is the person that they want to have involved in the conversation, not the police, not external resources, not people that they don't know. And and to highlight that those individuals within the community could be available for those discussions. So I guess all in all, I think it is a community. It is a community initiative. It's up to the community to understand this could happen. What are the signs of it happening if it does? And how can we nip it in the bud basically before it does escalate? And what other resources can we utilize from within the community and sometimes from outside of the community if needed, and not to be ashamed to ask for help, and to normalize those conversations, I think is also very important
Such a
as
good
well.
point, Dr. Judy. Most people across cultures will be in denial about mistreatment. They may not actually even realize what is happening is not right. Um, what kind of help or resources can our government or leaders create or work on to provide safe and respectful environment for elderly in communities, or something that you have seen or read about or experienced that works in other countries? Maybe we can incorporate that here.
Um, yeah, I think what I really like to emphasize is that I'm a huge advocate for community engagement and reach out. I really hesitate sometimes when organizations say that we do community outreach, but they expect the community to come to them. I would push that envelope and say, actually, it should be the other way around. It should be organizations going into community for that outreach. Because the reality is, many communities, especially immigrant ones and newly immigrant ones, they don't know what exists out there. Additionally, some of these communities might come from backgrounds in which even reaching out to organizations is a form of charitable
Oh
reach
my
out.
goodness.
And for them, that
Such
is
a good point. Absolutely
right.
right. Yeah.
And I don't think, and I think that's missed out sometimes, because I think about, for example, back home, the only time that you reach out to a not for profit or a charitable organization is if you didn't have family, if you didn't belong to a tribe, if you didn't have a community that backs you up. You're basically a loner,
Absolutely.
right? And so when you come here with your family, it could be shameful
Mhm.
sometimes if you have your adult children with you and then you reach out to a not for profit, because then your adult child will think, what will the community say if they know my parent is reaching out to the community? That I, as the adult child, am not looking after them? I mean, that's just a kind of a hypothetical
Yeah.
scenario. But having conversations with some older adults, they do talk about how back home, these not for profits are actually charitable organizations. And so even when they come to Canada, they don't assume and they don't expect to get help from them because it's not for them, because they have family, they have community. So I think to normalize accessing these not-for-profits is important, and we only can normalize it if organizations realize they need to reach out to these communities. They need to normalize conversations about the resources they have. They need to build gradual trust and relationship with them by earning it. We can't go into communities assuming they'll trust us because we're a community, we're a not for profit, or we're a government organization. You need to trust us. In fact, I think if anything, historically, it's been shown that that doesn't work. It's rather the other way around, where that trust is gradually built and earned and given from that community to those organizations and agencies. So I think building that trust by doing community outreach to the community is a really important step. Denmark, I'll give you a really good example. Denmark has a rule in which, for preventative measures, a person who, as soon as they reach the age of 75, receives 2 visits from a social worker a year. And that social worker assesses the individual's well-being. It promotes the Aging in the Right Place initiative. They check to make sure that they're doing okay, that forms, medication, all of that, those necessary things are put in place. And this is something this is just a law thing. It's a government thing, where once you hit 75, you have to
You
you
will.
will receive 2 visits a year by a healthcare professional or a professional that can just check in on you. And that's also to combat the sense of loneliness. Maybe some older adults now don't have family to live with, but I also think it's a great way to also ensure that the older adult feels that they are still valuable and important, that the government is sending this person to check in on them, even if they have family. You actually get that individual checking in on you, which I think is a brilliant
Yes, I'm going
initiative.
to get emotional here. That is such an important thing. And my last point with you, I'm so happy that you brought it up. Sometimes it's just the individual personality. First of all, you've come to a new country. There could be a language gap, cultural differences. You don't know people around. And as you said, going and asking for help may be not the comfort zone of not only just that person, but the whole community. Like, why are you going and asking for help? Sometimes very simple things, and I'm not blaming anybody here. Even in doctors' offices, sometimes there are tons of pamphlets, there's a whole section there, but people walk past by it. And I'm always thinking, no, 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 I think you need to pick it up because you're new here. You need to know what kind of services are available, what kind of help you can get, what kind of support you can get. So thank you for bringing that last point, Dr. Judy. I really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. No, I appreciate it. And just on that last point, actually, you reminded me of a research that I came across that looked at the value of pamphlets and handouts, even if they're translated and interpreted. Actually, it has little to no value
Mm-hmm,
sometimes because, like you said, people walk
mm-hmm,
past them. And they may not understand why it's beneficial or how it could be beneficial
yeah,
to them. And I mean, think about you and I, where we are fluent in English and we know to an extent what is right and wrong for us, or what is good and not good for us. Even when our doctor gives us a handout for an exercise or some form of
mm-hmm,
knowledge, we usually fold it and put it in our bag. And maybe at some point, as we're cleaning our stuff, we'll come across this. So imagine a person who doesn't speak the language. And I also want to emphasize that we assume everyone can speak, can read and write their own language. We actually do have illiterate individuals who are illiterate in their own language. They don't read it and they don't write it. So even if we're assuming that this is great, this is a pamphlet in your language, here, it might be embarrassing for that person, if they are illiterate in their
yeah,
own language, to actually say, I actually can't read my own language. And so what they'll do is, it could be that they pretend, I
mm-hmm,
can read this, fold it, and say,
yeah,
yeah, thank you. And when there is a follow up. They might pretend and say, yes, I read it. Thank you. But the fact is, you have to sit down with your patient or your client, go through this pamphlet, emphasize why it's important to them. And if they can't read it, you read it for them to highlight the value of it. And then hopefully you can connect with a family member or a support person for that person to follow up on that, as opposed to just giving them a whole batch of pamphlets and handouts and assuming that they will see the value in it.
Thank you for bringing amazing points. I hope people who will listen to our conversation will feel a little bit empowered to ask questions. I always say I'm shameless when it comes to asking questions. I've reporter's background in me, so I really don't care like what the other person is thinking. But not everybody is thinking like that. So thank you for your time, sharing your expertise, Dr. Joudi. Stay well.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am really excited about that.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.